Well, good morning. I know some of you were here at least for Ragtime 101. If you were not, this is going to hurt you when you take the quiz later, and yes, there is a quiz. So good morning. Welcome to our second unit of Ragtime. This is Ragtime 102. I am joined by, on the end, Martin Face Melter Spitznagel.
Good morning. Hi.
Who has a black belt in Ragtime. And his comrade in the force, Dr. Brian Wright. He earned that doctor, yes. I may not be a doctor, but I've seen one on TV. So, this is the core of the Ragtime era, how it shaped America. In our last section, for those of you who did not, we discussed how classical and popular music forms fused in the second half of the 19th century in America to become what we consider America's first indigenous form, homegrown form of music, that would be ragtime. So that is what we are here to discuss today. So we're going to get right to the questions, and we will have hopefully some time for questions at the end. So the first question, how would you define ragtime? And then, how would you describe it to a novice? Think of describing a sunrise to a blind person.
Wow. It's a little early for poetry, Bill. Well, Dr. Wright, I think you should. You have the degree in ragtime. Why don't you start us off?
Well, I'll back up and say that when I teach courses at the University of Pittsburgh, one of the first questions we ask at the start of the semester is, what is music? How do you define music? And if you think about that, there's so many ways to approach this. And generally, I think casually, people will define music as something that sounds good to them. How often do you hear the expression, oh, that's music to my ears, when you really like the sound of something? And consequently, a lot of people are often quick to dismiss things that they don't like as not music. And I mean, if I had a nickel for every time I've heard somebody tell me, oh, I can't stand rap, that isn't music. Well, according to our definition in the music class, it is. Whether you like it or not is beside the point. What we do is we describe music as humanly organized sound. And this is a large catch-all definition that enables us to describe everything from Gregorian chant to Beethoven to the 20th century works of people like John Cage, which otherwise, playing the spikes on a cactus and putting an electrical reproducer up to it may not be what you think of as music, but it is humanly organized sound when John Cage does it, and so we have to consider that as music. So I'm going to take the same approach to what is ragtime and say that, at least according to me or in my mind, ragtime is really not much more than a syncopated melody line over a regular march-like accompaniment. Whether that was composed in 1897 or composed in 2015 doesn't really matter. They're both ragtime if they fit that mold. Whether it has the structure of A, B, B, A, C, C, D, D, or A, B, A, C, D doesn't really matter to me. If it fits the mold of a syncopated melody line, and we already discussed what syncopation was in the first class, if it has a syncopated melody line and a march-like accompaniment, it's ragtime. But Martin may want to add to that.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Brian. Oh my gosh. But yeah, I think for me, just to add to what you said, what makes it ragtime is the interplay. Is that the intersection between sort of this, the left hand doing its own thing, the right hand doing its own thing, and I think as far as how to describe it to a novice. Wow, I mean, because ragtime can mean a couple different things, right? It can refer to a historical period in our country, and it can. I think for me, how would I describe it to a novice?
Well, can I just interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
Because, many of you know my wife Yuko, who is she's here with me at the festival. She's not here this morning, but when I go with her to Japan, and we were just there the last several weeks. We came back about a week ago. She tries to tell people that my husband plays ragtime. And of course, this always elicits confused looks from them. And so her way of describing ragtime to a novice is just to immediately go into na 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 na, and she doesn't even use words. That's it. And then they all get it at that point. So
That's great. That's
great.
Well,
I'm sorry. I'm thinking if she were here, how would she describe ragtime?
Yeah,
to a
that's
novice?
great. I want to use that from now on. What is ragtime? What do you do? Na 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 na. You're like,
Well, now I have a two-part question. Why was ragtime so popular? And at the same time, why was it so divisive? At one point, the Musicians Union in New York actually banned their members from playing ragtime. There were all kinds of editorials in the newspapers lambasting it because of the syncopation.
Yeah.
And when jazz came out, Anne Shaw Faulkner had that great article. She was speaking of jazz. Does jazz put the sin in syncopation? And so yeah, everybody was using that then, though. But Martin, you wanna-
well, why was it so popular? I think it was music you could move to. There was music up until that point. Of course, had a dance element to it, but very stately, very formal, courtly in a way. And ragtime, just because of that interplay between the hands, gets you moving. And it was, I think, it was associated with sin. Of course, the last night, E.B. Blake talked about, it was low music from whence it came. It was music that originated in red light districts and bordellos and sporting houses, and of course, respectable people didn't listen to that stuff, right? They just didn't listen. And if I always use the example of, most of the piano players back in the turn of the century were women, and so you can imagine if your little daughter was taking piano lessons, all of a sudden she comes home and plays. The devil is in your child. So I think it was popular. I think because it was popular because it combined this rhythm and energy and it was a little bit rough around the edges that I think was exciting to the young people and got them moving.
I'm never going to get the image of May Ofterheit out of my head now, playing Charleston rag like that.
Well, also the syncopations are an unexpected element, and that's, if you're trying to move to the syncopations while you're dancing, it causes jerks and excitement, and that's part of it. The emotion that it elicited scared some people.
Right.
It was a taboo.
Well, if I can go in a little bit different direction with this, I mean, we could really spend all day on just this one question alone because there's so many reasons why ragtime was popular. I think another big reason was, first of all, there had been built up in the latter half of the 19th century this whole music publishing machine in this country. Music publishers were really coming into their own around the turn of the century. Copyright law changes in the late 19th century had really strengthened their ability to control the material that they published and profit from it. And so there was a big publishing industry waiting for something to publish and put out there that people would buy and would be profitable for them. And ragtime suited that, in part because for every Charleston rag and for every ragtime showpiece, there are probably 100 much simpler, much more, could we say, accessible rags to the average pianist of the day. A lot of rags, if you look at pieces by like Charles L. Johnson, this is not to put them down, but pieces by George Botsford or Charles L. Johnson, they're not exactly very technically demanding in their published form. So this was music that anybody with a couple of years of piano lessons, which a lot of people at that time had, could expect to play. And it's fun to play. And Bill McNally also in the last session talked about repetition in ragtime. And ragtime is full of repetition. And so once you master, let's say, the left hand little oompa march-like bass, and in many rags that just kind of gets repeated throughout the rest of the piece. So if you're a piano student or somebody who has just a few years of experience, once you get that left hand going, you can now focus the attention on the right hand, and you've got little simple repeated melodies like black and white rag. You get the little patterns, and it's easy to learn. So I won't say all ragtime is easy to play, but there was enough of it that there was a huge market for it among amateur and accomplished amateur pianists who wanted something fun to play. So I think that feeds into it.
That leads me into the next question, which there was more than ragtime available, obviously, before and during. Do you see any parallel growth of music forms? Intermezzos, something that David Jason has always called suspect. What is an intermezzo? Waltzes, classical forms that could be...
Well, should we talk first a little bit more about why was it so divisive?
Yes, you can do that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to take over here.
Oh,
but-
that's
no.
fine.
I mean, I think divisive in part because it was, from whence the music came. I think, divisive as well, that in the way that all of the music the kids listen to is divisive. I mean, if you think of your children and your grandchildren and, like, oh, I can't believe they can listen to that. How do they think that's music? What are they getting out of that? I have that experience with my nieces and nephews who are all 16 on down, and I'm like, what is this? Like 7 minutes of just. I was like, what are you? It's not doing anything. It's not saying anything. I'm shaking my cane at them. I think truly, I think I've always related it to that there's, these, what the kids like sometimes doesn't make sense to the older folks.
Well, I think that's a big part of it. I think also, Bill, I keep trying to tie this back to the earlier session, but Bill was talking about Edward McDowell and these other American composers of the late 19th century who were trying to establish a unique American voice within the sort of parameters of traditional Western art music, let's say. And not really succeeding very well at it because they always sounded like pale imitators of the Europeans, but they were trying to work within that harmonic framework and trying to create pieces that were, genteel, but not always, but what am I trying to say? Within these expectations of some harmonic interest. And I think to a lot of people raised on that kind of music at the last turn of the century, ragtime, not only was it from places like brothels and saloons, or did they associate it with those places, but harmonically, and I don't, again, mean this as a slight against ragtime, a lot of those popular rags, not Scott Joplin, not Joseph Lamb, not the stuff we often celebrate and hold most highly here, but a lot of the popular rags by Botsford and Johnson were repetitious, and they often did not really go into any great harmonic, interesting territory. I mean, they seemed like very trite, repetitious, simple pieces, and so I think to a lot of folks, what value is there in this music? It seems like commercial, processed, just pumped out music to sell to the masses, and to some extent a lot of it was. And so they could look down their noses at it for that reason. And also, if you listen to much pop music from the 1880s and 1890s, songs that were sort of maudlin and sentimental were really in. I mean, the late Victorian era, they loved nothing more than a really sad, tear-jerking song of the things like Father, Dear Father, Come Home With Me Now, which was a very popular temperance song by Henry Clay Work, the guy who wrote Grandfather's Clock. But Father, Dear Father, Come Home With Me Now tells the story of a young girl who is going to the bar in the middle of the night to fetch her father, who is a drunkard, who's at the bar, because mother is home with young Benny, her younger brother, who is very sick and who is dying. And Benny's asking for father. He just wants to see father before he dies, this 4-year-old child. And so every verse, Benny is getting sicker, and the girl has to keep going to the bar, asking her father to come home. And, he apparently doesn't, so she goes home, and now Benny is really on the edge of death. And finally, the last verse, she comes back to the bar room, Benny is dead, and you're still here drinking. And, this really got to these Victorian people. They love this kind of sad, sentimental stuff, and ragtime was just the absolute opposite of that.
Wow, yeah.
And it just wasn't fashionable at first to play something that was happy and upbeat. I think.
Gosh, yeah. If you weren't an alcoholic at the beginning of that song, you would be by the end.
Right.
I mean, they did have a depression in the 1890s because of the silver devaluation, but also in music, obviously. Okay, so let me get back to this one. There were the other music forms. So, technology's not my friend right now. Waltzes, intermezzo, classical forms. Did they remain stagnant or stymied while ragtime exploded, or did they progress maybe a little more slowly?
You want to take this?
There were waltzes, obviously.
Of course.
Charles Johnson wrote waltzes.
Yeah, I mean,
Scott
I think
Joplin wrote
we
waltzes.
have an interesting confluence, of course, in Joplin's Pathina, which is I think an advancement of both forms, and it's an addition of syncopation to the waltz form, and then addition of waltz, time to ragtime ideas. I think at least stagnant or stymied. I don't think so. I think stagnant and stymied are too strong. I think, like anything else, there are fads and trends, and kind of the flavor of the day. And ragtime was for sure the flavor of the day. For the first 20 years of the 20th century.
Well, yeah, let's point that out. The swing era lasted about 8 years. Disco lasted, 4 years too long, and that was. And ragtime was around for 2 decades and more.
Yeah, I think this goes back to your early point, and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but ragtime advanced as part of a larger shift in our country, right? When we became less Eurocentric and more American-centric. World War I, I think, gave us a sense of identity we didn't have before. I think we were sort of the poor man's Europeans up until that point. And so, waltzes and intermezzos, these classical forms, European forms, I don't think they stagnated or stymied, but they definitely were not the
I don't want to say they disappeared, but I think they definitely faded from the scene quite a bit, as far as especially just popular. Again, we're going back to piano, but as sort of popular pieces for the piano. I don't get the sense. Well, in the years just before the real explosion of ragtime in the late 1890s as a published piano piece, there were just gazillions of waltzes and intermezzos. And I don't know that 10 years into the ragtime era, if you were to look at waltzes or intermezzos, and I've not done this in any great detail, but I don't think you would find that they were significantly different in 1909 or 1910 than they had been in 1896 or 97 in terms of just waltzes and intermezzos.
Well, but they had a cultural cachet still. Like a lot of Joplin's tunes are subtitled Afro-American intermezzo, right? There was, so those terms at least seem like they might have had some cultural cachet to give some legitimacy to this new music.
Right, but I think by the 19-teens and early 20s, and again, Bill, maybe you can speak better to this. I get the sense that there weren't nearly as many of these so-called intermezzos or waltzes being published. And so I don't know if I would say stagnated or stymied as much as just sort of faded.
They were being reprinted from an earlier time. Okay, well, let's get into this classical thing. Let's point out that Scott Joplin, Joseph Lamb, and that ilk were not the only composers of what we would consider classic ragtime. There were some very fine examples from other composers. I think of Affinity Rag, Irene Kozak. It's a classic rag, it clearly is. Did these composers, did they benefit from a classical upbringing and what of well-trained composers of popular rags? That would be George Cobb, for example, who did not approach some of the level of Scott Joplin and his peers. Do you feel they benefited from this upbringing?
Absolutely. How could you not?
Joe Lamb did not get much in the way of formal music lessons, and yet, I guess his sister was his primary teacher.
Right. I don't think that it was necessarily a requisite for a budding ragtime composer. You mentioned Joseph Lamb.
Classic rag composer.
Right, classic rag composer. Well, how many of them are we going to?
Right. Well, classic ragtime, and I think it's fair to say that Joplin, who's sort of the prototype classic ragtime composer. He certainly valued music education and classical music, and wanted to be. He wrote an opera, right? The guy, wanted to be a classical composer and sought out opportunities to learn what he could. I had a professor in college who said, no education is ever wasted. So it would be hard to argue, I think, that classical training, classical upbringing, musical fluency wouldn't be helpful to you.
Oh, and to go back to Joseph Lamb, Carol Bienkowski tells us in her book, that although Joseph Lamb perhaps didn't have extensive formal training, his sister did, and he spent considerable time with her Chopin scores and some of her other classical pieces, and presumably she would have coached him along somewhat, and he did express quite an interest in those pieces, so he was familiar with a good deal of classical music, I think.
And the Intermezzo magazine, which
right, and the Etude magazine and things like that brought classical music to the masses.
So, but that term classic rag has always been a little fraught for me, because it always felt like, and maybe this is not true, I know John Stark, was a big
Coined it, yeah.
Coined it, yeah. But
It's a marketing term.
But as a marketing term, but it seems like now we use it to sort of stratify, right? So George Botts for black and white rag is not a classic rag, but sugar cane is, and so it seems like a slightly like a term we use after the fact to stratify the music based on complexity or taste. Whereas black and white rag, outsold sugarcane by about a 1,000,000 to 1. So,
Right. Well, that's a different discussion, I guess. So, okay.
I know, right?
Well, let's go to the opposite of that. Was there good ragtime developed by untrained musicians? I mean, of course it was, and do you feel, technology is working here, the trained arrangers had a hand in making it even more than that? I would talk about people like Will Tyers. He was from, I think, Dominican Republic, but he was very well trained for a black at that time. He was a great arranger. You had Cliff Hess, who more or less in the 1910s lived with Irving Berlin. Irving Berlin was not trained, and he could not notate. So throughout his life, he had someone like Cliff Hess as the early example, lived with him and notated and actually helped to voice and chord his music. So as these untrained people, they depended on arrangers.
Well, I guess a problem here, and again, Bill, this may be more your territory, is to what extent were some of these composers untrained? I mean, a lot of these composers, we probably know more about a lot of them than we ever had before, thanks largely to the efforts of this man here who has spent so much time researching the lives and biographies of these composers.
Thank you.
So, but so many holes and gaps remain, and so many of these composers remain very shadowy figures. And how do we really know the extent of their training in their youth or in their upbringing? So the ones that we want to call untrained, do we really know for sure that they didn't have more training?
Well, most of them had public school, a couple of years of piano and
But
general
I think
music.
also of like Robert Hampton and Artie Matthews arranging some of his pieces for
Yes.
publication. And
Well, there's a delineation, right, between trained in performance and then trained in writing the music down and arranging. And I think one of the cool things about the Joplin Festival and events like it is that there is a very real recreation of this environment of musicians learning from one another, right? And so I think musicians come here, just like they would in Atlantic City or New York or St. Louis or Sedalia. They come, they hang out, they learn from each other, and they sort of train each other up, in at least the performance aspect of it. But yeah, it would be hard to argue that the arrangers didn't have an impact.
Okay, I didn't get this up quite soon enough, but there were thousands. Okay, popular ragtime we know of between 1900 or 1897 and 1920. There were maybe 1,500 piano rags published, but there were thousands and thousands of popular songs that referenced ragtime. Alexander's Ragtime Band being one of the primary examples. Or there was that whatever rag. I mean, how many that rags? Over 100. That American rag, that Italian rag, that classical rag, and so on. The same guys, many more songs written without those mentions. Yiddle, play your fiddle. Okay. Are these part of the music called ragtime, or should they refer only to piano rags?
You got this one, Dr. Wright. Go ahead. I need a second to cool off.
well, I'm somebody, I like to approach the music somewhat on its own terms, and I'm somebody who, whenever I can, I avoid assigning labels to music like this because, of course, you're going to have people who will argue, vehemently one way or the other. But in my mind, if it was ragtime to them, at least in widespread term, I have no problem considering it ragtime today. So, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, especially if you read a lot of these songs, you'll find that the term ragtime was applied pretty indiscriminately to all popular music of the day. So to somehow argue now that stuff was not ragtime when it clearly was to them, and of course this is now going against my own definition earlier of ragtime needing to have a syncopated melody line over a march-like bass, and clearly a lot of these songs that referenced ragtime did not always have that. Although it depends on how you play them. You could play any of those songs really in ragtime, and so why not consider them ragtime if the people of the day did?
It goes back to that earlier idea of ragtime being a couple of different things, a historical period, a genre, and also a style. And so I guess depending on sort of, you can make anything ragtime, right? I've made had a lot of fun making things out of ragtime, and so it's it's an interesting question. Was it ragtime to them? Does that make it ragtime? Yeah, it just the piano rag scene. I love these festivals. They're piano-centric. Obviously, I'm invested in a piano-centric event because that's what I do. But I think it'd be fair to say that for the most part, people were hearing ragtime in bands and orchestras and live dance music. I mean, they were hearing it not just stately on a nice piano. They were hearing it in the streets and in the dance halls. And it was a much more pervasive thing than just sort of a small slice that we celebrate here.
I'd like to do a more contemporary reference to that. Having to do with influence. There were a couple hundred songs written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, but we all know that was a John song and that was a Paul song, and maybe Paul collaborated on this. It doesn't matter. One of them may have bought the ink while the other wrote the song, but they all had that influence. So they're all, Yesterday is a Lennon-McCartney song just as much as Help. So it has to do with that influence. And the whole era, ragtime, I've also thought it would be a great Ken Burns documentary because it's a lifestyle. It's how people thought. It's how people felt. J.P. Morgan was ragtime, whether he wanted to be or not. Stanford White. And if you've seen the film or the play Ragtime, you would understand. It's the essence of who the people were and what America was at that time. It was a ragtime. I own a ragtime dog, a ragtime cat, a ragtime piano, a ragtime flat. And that was 1900.
Yeah.
So
What you're selling, ragtime meat, doesn't that come into there? I think it does by the time you
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Please never say ragtime meat again. Let's just agree to leave that out of the
So
lexicon.
comparing, not too specifically, but 1898 to 1908, or 1900, 1910, either. Why did the music grow so quickly? And I mean, it just exploded, spurring the sales of pianos. For a reference, there were 8 times the amount of pianos sold in 1910 than there were in 1900. 8 times. Think of the trickle effect on the economy right there, just in pianos. Because to have pianos, you have to have more lumber, so more lumbermen are hired. And you have to have the cast iron plates and the strings, so more people working in steel. People doing the assembly of these pianos, people doing the delivery of the pianos, the ones who learned to tune it, the ones who taught it. Just that growth alone was huge for the economy, and ragtime drove that. But why did it speed up so much after 1900, where it was slow in the 1890s?
These are big questions, Bill. Well, I think it goes back to that earlier thing that Brian said about there was an apparatus that existed, a music publishing apparatus that was ready. I think there were you could probably argue there were advancements in manufacturing that enabled faster production of instruments. I think cheaper. And I think that what you said earlier about accessible is really, really important, because it was a thing that the back of every sheet music was try this out on your piano at home. Right? The idea was that this was something that you could do, you could participate, you could create. And so I think
Well, and there was a new model for marketing music at this time as well. In the middle 1800s, I think the piano started to become a fixture in most middle-class homes about the time of the Civil War, just before, in the 1850s and 60s, with those, we've all seen them, those Chickering square pianos that sort of started to really show up en masse in the mid-19th century. And then as the upright piano, and particularly as the player piano comes in right around 1900 at a price point which many people can afford, this music is coming more and more into the home. And going back to what I was trying to say, which is that the marketing models shifted. So in the middle 1800s, most music that was sold in this country, that was printed and sold, a good deal of it went directly through music teachers. And so music teachers were, in many cases, the source of music for their students. How convenient. And this also helped to reinforce this sense of, America wanting to be just like the Europeans, because of course they lauded composers like Chopin and Schumann and Beethoven, and they wanted, piano teachers wanted in the tradition of this good Germanic music. Of course, many of those piano teachers were German immigrants, like Joplin's teacher, Julian Weiss. So a lot of them would promote this sort of Germanic tradition in the music that they bought from publishers and distributors to resell to their students. And of course, at the turn of the century, we start getting these big department stores. We start getting just a bigger commercial mechanism for distributing things like sheet music. And so it goes largely out of the hands of music teachers and into this more commercial arena of department stores, now with sheet music that has to have colorful covers to attract buyers' attention. You look at any sheet music published before about 1895, and they're often, black and white with usually very little imagery, just, maybe a lot of flowery ornamentations around the border and really fancily scripted, he's got a lot of sheet music, fancily scripted text and titles. And then with the advancements in color lithography printing in the 1890s, and this more commercial approach to competition, selling sheet music and competing for the public's taste, I think that fueled this big explosion, because now there's sheet music that looks really cool, like those E.T. Paul covers. I'm sure Bill has a few of those embedded in there somewhere.
Yeah, there they are. That's
okay. You want to pick one that people can see a little larger? Can you expand them?
Yeah.
Any of the E.T. Paul ones.
I'm thinking,
can you give us that to the bottom right, that white one, whatever that is? Yeah. This looks to me like it's probably more, okay, so a lot of the sheet music you find in the 1870s and 1880s looks more or less like this, which is perhaps, when it all looks like that, how inspiring is that really when you want to pick up a new piece? They all look the same. And then you get pieces like this now with these brilliant, bright, colorful covers. And I think that just made it so much more appealing. And then the music itself was a little bit more accessible and easier to play and fun to play. And I think just all of that, a better marketing approach, catchy music that people wanted to play, contributed to this explosion.
Yeah.
Okay, also, technology had to have something to do with that, I think.
Well, and right, and this was also...
electricity.
Well, electricity and the player pianos and phonographs, new ways of bringing music into the home, and so there were a lot of rags recorded, not on solo piano, but by marching bands and banjoists on this new medium of phonograph records at the turn of the century, and it all just sort of reinforced. It was really the first mass market popular music, I think, even more so than the Stephen Foster stuff and songs of that ilk had been.
Well, now we're into the ragtime era in the 1910s. How did the music advance or change in content in the 1910s? And did players and consumers feed these advances with what they were buying, what they were asking about? Other influences, there's piano rolls, records, playing contests, which playing contests actually go back to the time of Bach, I know, but just the same, they were publicized at that time. But your average pianist there were more girls playing ragtime than there were boys in this country. It's very clearly because they got the musical education. They were sent out to get finished by dad, and some of them came back unfinished because of the ragtime. But that was at finishing school, so that's why there were so many women composers and women music demonstrators. But did they help this? What fed the changes in the 1910s?
Well, I have some very strong thoughts on this, which is that I think when these devices like the player piano, and especially the new introduction of hand-played rolls, which only came about, you'll know the exact year, Bill, but I think it was pretty much around 1910 or 11 that you really start getting the hand-played rolls, as opposed to the machine-punched ones, which would be almost exact reproductions of what's in the sheet music and often sounding a little stilted and a little too mechanical.
Done with a ruler.
Right. Yeah. And so then these hand-played ones start coming in that reproduce the playing of a professional pianist. And so now the playing of somebody like Victor Arden or Charlie Straight can come directly into somebody's home. And these were phenomenally talented pianists, much higher level than most of your average home pianists of the day. And I think along with phonograph records and improvements in recording technology by the teens and 20s meant that pianos could be recorded better and reproduced better on phonographs. And so you start getting professional musicians now in the home, and little Isabella or whatever, who is 12 years old or 14 years old and who's had 6 years of piano lessons and can play a few polite intermezzos and maybe get her way through black and white rag, just can't compete with somebody of the likes of Zez Confrey or Charlie Straight on these roles. And so I think it started to move out of the realm of a do-it-yourself music, which is what it had started out as, and into this realm of the professionals and the really well-trained, technically gifted pianists who could make it even more exciting. And so I think this birth of novelty piano in the 20s is really fueled by these new technologies.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to jump in here. Or
No,
There's an irony I want to point out before you get to that, is that these played forms just of instrumental songs, when you went out to the theaters or went out to almost anything except maybe films. Films, of course, very popular. You almost invariably had a vocalist or something. You didn't just hear a piano playing. There was more piano playing in the homes. Mike Bernard was one of the exceptions, but you didn't go to a Zez Confrey concert or something like that. It was more about the singing and getting the audience involved. Even if you went to silent films, you would do songs in between reels, because that would do the community.
And that's true at the home. I mean, if you look at the average music in most people's piano benches of the day, it wasn't the instrumental rags. A lot of it was songs, and I think most of the people that were playing this stuff were playing really just for the benefit of having accompaniment to sing to. And I think that was, probably 95% of popular music at the time was vocal songs for which the pianist provided accompaniment. Once you can get a player piano to do that, or you can buy a record of a professional singing and you don't have to do it so much yourself, I think that changes things.
So, I mean, are folks clear what we mean by ragtime music advance or change in content? Does that make sense? I mean, are we saying that it advanced?
The earlier rags were not as complex. They didn't have quite as many syncopations, quite as many chord changes.
Let me give an example.
They weren't classically. Some of them actually in the 1910s were based on classical music forms, like Russian rag, for example, Hungarian rag.
Just as an example, Gil Pickles, which is a great example of sort of that mass market.
And that is simple because you have three notes, and by repeating those three notes, you hit on a syncopation every now and then. So it's derived syncopation.
As opposed to this more advanced, I mentioned the novelty style of like Zez Confrey. This was what, 10 years later? I mean. Very different sound, much more technical. Yeah, I mean, that didn't take long to do. Right, just calendar-wise, the era wasn't really that long. I mean, I wonder if some of that was just organic, like it just because it was so pervasive and became more professionals did it, that it just became more self-referential and like ideas just naturally got more complex.
I mean, if you even compare James Scott's rags, like Frog Legs, things from 1908, 1910, to Joseph Lamb in 1915, Ragtime Nightingale, Joplin, they're so far advanced from even what Scott was doing.
Oh, but you've Mark, I mean, you're both composers. You've seen that in your own work as well, right? Your early compositions were simpler,
yes,
and your later stuff is more complex. And that, I mean, do you think just the trajectory of that is that just growing as a musician, more influences? I mean, some of that would probably was organic in addition to these other influences.
Okay. Anything else to add, or?
Not on that one.
Okay. Now we get into the part where we're at the end of the era, of the ragtime era. And again, while we couch that as 1897 or 1917, it really, there was some crossover in 1921, 22. Stride piano is ragtime. Novelty piano is ragtime. They just different label. So what cultural changes do you think ragtime brought to the United States? It was homegrown, of course. And did the culture and music feed off each other in a symbiotic frenzy, in red, of sorts, leading us into the jazz age?
Well, first I'll just say symbiotic frenzy is a great name for a rag. So if anybody's looking, if anybody's looking for ideas there.
I get the credit.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to cheat, Professor, and just the answer's kind of in the question, right? I mean, it fed off. I mean, the culture and the music fed off each other in a symbiotic frenzy that led us into the jazz age. And I heard a great story that apparently apocryphal, but that was from David Refkin, who apparently it's like some kid with a little radio transponder, approached D.B. Blake, in the late 70s. And said, Mr. Blake, would you consider yourself a jazz pianist? And Yubi, who didn't realize he was on the radio, said, young man, in my day, saying jazz was like saying, right? So don't say jazz to me. And and he didn't realize he was on the radio. But yeah, I think, I mean, I just hope it's true. I just want that story to be true so much. But yeah, I think it's impossible to argue that the optimism and the energy in the music, I mean, you can draw a straight line from that and our expanding influence in the world. I mean, I say often in my performances, in France, they didn't call it ragtime, they called it American music, right? This was the sound of our young country expanding forward, vibrant,
Well, it's interesting to note that the three biggest cultural changes, well, two of the three in our history are centered around wars. Civil War, not so much, but World War I. Think of fashions and American mores before that. And then we say, well, we got to be more moral, and we bring in prohibition. What does that do? All hell breaks loose in this country. And the other big cultural change was around the Vietnam War in the 60s. And between 63 and 69, look at the huge changes in American culture, in music. It was almost that extreme between 1915 and 1921.
Well, you were talking about this in the first session. Was ragtime the first really identifiable, uniquely American music? And we decided that the short answer is yes, although it's a little more complicated. But clearly at the turn of the century or in the late 1800s, Americans still, in many aspects of their lives, looked to Europe for inspiration, and they wanted to emulate European fashions. And in dress, in music, in literature, in almost everything, Americans held Europeans in such high regard and basically wanted to be like that. And of course, for a number of reasons, they couldn't ever quite achieve that. But with ragtime, it seems to have sort of, and then World War I, seems to have sort of changed the whole cultural outlook to be one of, well, why do we have to emulate the Europeans? Clearly, we now have our own identity, and we tend to forget that I think in the early 20th century, in 1900 and 1910, the United States was not yet a world superpower. It wasn't really recognized as being a sort of leading nation, and it really was sort of around World War I and then into World War II where that changed, and ragtime was the soundtrack to that, and it I think to some degree helped boost Americans' confidence and boost Americans' sense of identity as our own country. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's overstating it, but that's how I see it.
I don't think so. I think it really was, which is why it's so weird that it just vanished, because it was so pervasive, so important to our psyche, and then now you go,
But that's also where, to go back to the start of this whole discussion and how are we going to define ragtime, and in my mind, if we stick with that simple definition, which again, not everybody has to agree to, but if we consider ragtime a syncopated melody line and some kind of regular rhythmic accompaniment, did it ever really vanish, or did it just keep on changing, keep on developing? I mean, clearly Fats Waller's piano stuff in the 30s, even, by that definition, would still be very much ragtime, and even a lot of popular music well into rock and roll and beyond, you could argue on some level is still still showing the roots of ragtime, and you could even argue maybe if you wanted to really stretch it that it still is ragtime. So, I mean, it kept changing, but I don't know that I would say it vanished really in the way that a lot of the books will tell you.
Well, now comes the fun part, questions. I'm sure that there's a person or two that might have some questions. We can barely see you, but I still want you to be polite and raise your hand. We'll do the best. Dr. McNally has a question.
No, honestly, it's something that directly addresses that last question, and it's something that I failed to mention in the previous class session. And that's the great Czech composer Antonín Dvořák. He spent several years near the end of his life in the United States, mostly in New York City, and then kind of touring around the New York State and spending some time in Niagara Falls.
But didn't he get as far as Iowa? I thought he spent a good part of his trip in Iowa.
Yeah, he got further much too. Anyhow,
I'd put a Z in there.
article for Harper's Magazine. And the article, first of all, there's a really, really important little quote from it. And the quote is, "You're all trying to emulate these European composers. Why are you doing that? Look inward. Look at Negro spirituals. Look at American Indian melodies." Now that's a whole other topic. But he pointed out with absolute clarity, it's right here in your own backyard. But more interestingly, the rest of the article is about changing the way Americans ought to approach musical education. Now, all elements of this article were about 20 years ahead of its time. But he predicted it. And he also had great clarity as to where the American music education system needed to go in order to
engender that. It reminds me of a story. I can't remember the composer. It was some very famous classical composer, and George Gershwin met him and asked him if he could take Ravel. So Gershwin, meets Ravel and says, wants to study with Ravel, and Ravel's like, "Mr. Gershwin, how much money do you make a year?" And George Gershwin was like, "I'm at $600,000," which, of course, in 1920 was a lot of money. And and the story that I heard is Mr. Ravel was like, "I think I'm going to take some lessons with you." So,
All right, anyone else now? Yes, in the center.
An important point in the introduction of music to America was radio in the 1906 and 1910. And then also a major change from 10-band melody to the great option of racing coming in and then taking over the music world for a while.
I'll make a correction there. Radio as a commercial broadcasting medium didn't really come into the early 1920s. So, there was Morse code radio broadcast for ships in 1906, but not of audio of
Right.
music. So it wasn't yet really a major player. But certainly immigration from other parts of the world brought. How much of that ended up right away in published music, though, as anything other than just sort of stereotyped and
yeah,
is I don't know. I'd have to think about that a little bit more.
yeah.
I'm sorry. I guess
Trying
I
to
kind of
decide.
steamrolled over the second half of the question. Would you mind repeating?
Well, just the idea of the obviously the influence. I think just to the point about radio is that radio, of course, was the latest in a succession of technologies that had made music more accessible. From the Edison cylinders to records to that was sort of in a succession of things that was bringing music into the home.
Well, and what radio did when it finally did come in, and to some degree phonograph records before it, was to sort of establish a national voice for music or a national outlet, because Bill touched on this in his session that in the late 1890s and turn of the century, music scenes were still fairly local and regional, and that's why we get a different sound to the ragtime that was being published in the New York area to say what was being published here in Sedalia or what would have been published out in California. Is that before these sort of mass communication devices, the sheet music may have gotten around somewhat, but the ways of playing were still very local. You could only really hear the music that was coming from around you.
So I have one in the back here.
Here's Rosina Levino Boca, piano playing in the 20s, I think. I just remember a professor reading one piece of it. She says, too many American students have no sense of rhythm because they listen to ragtime.
Yeah, that's a great point because I mean, truly, that mass consumerism. I mean, by default, I mean, the Walmart down the street. How many little businesses did that kill in Sedalia? And and would we go back to before? Probably not. But I think there is that price tag to accessibility and consistency and.
Well, and I can understand how somebody at that time would have seen it that way, and perhaps there's more than a nugget of truth there. I mean, ragtime music, and this was always a big concern of my piano teacher when I started bringing in rags to my lessons, is that in her mind there was simply not enough variety to really become a well-rounded pianist if one plays too much ragtime, because as I mentioned earlier, typically in most rags the left hand is doing the same repetitious sort of oompa, oompa, oompa bass line, and you don't develop, if you stick exclusively to that, or if you play predominantly ragtime, you're not working the sort of independence of the hands. You're not working the rhythmic independence of the right hand from the left hand, and the ability to play more rhythmically complicated pieces, such as a lot of the classical, so-called classical music of the 1800s, especially with the Romantics, Bach, Chopin. If you're used to playing just oompa, going from that to a Beethoven sonata is going to be a big change, and could probably hinder your ability to think independently enough between the hands to get the rhythms correct.
But I would argue that would apply if you just. I mean, it's like one of those things. I mean, if you only eat one kind of thing, right, or you only do one kind of thing, regardless of what it is, you're going to sacrifice proficiency in other things. I mean,
right. But how much were these piano students still staying up on their classical studies, and if they were to spend too much time with the ragtime?
Well, gentlemen, I have to point out it's about time for recess here.
Okay.
Bell's going to ring. So I'd like to thank Dr. Brian Wright and Mr. Martin Spitznagel for coming and joining in this discussion. I hope we all learned.
Thank you, Bill.
And that we have a better idea of why this music exists.